off today. We have a work-study session with the Colorado Department of Local Affairs State Demography Office, and we have some visitors. It is November 20th at 10 a.m., and let's go ahead and do some quick introductions. My name is Mike Buck, Commissioner from District 1.
Dal Schroeder, Commissioner, District 2.
Wendy Holmes, Communication and Public Affairs Director.
Jennifer Jones, Community and Development Services.
Okay, well, we appreciate you guys coming out today, and with that, we'll let Nancy kick it off. And like I said, we appreciate you coming out today.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having us. It is a pleasure to be here. It's nice to get out of, I was going to say get out of the office, but mostly it's get out of my house since we are hybrid. But Neil and I are here today to talk about population, talk about future and past population, but also talk about our methods, because we know that how we put together both the estimates, which look back, and the projections, which look forward, we have very specific methods, and they are complicated. And usually only once or twice a year do we take the time to discuss those methods, explain the inputs, explain the assumptions that are part of these estimates and forecasts. Am I doing okay? Okay. So with that, this is going to be educational, and that was part of the reason we were out here, so that we can explain what inputs we use and how we come up with our future population, but to get input from you as well. We are looking to talk to all the communities in the state to find out what are your concerns and what are you looking at that may agree or contradict the type of data that we're looking at. So what are some of your concerns? What are you interested in? What is going on in Elbert County that you hope we will be addressing so that maybe we can tailor some of our comments to you?
Well, I'll kick it off, but one of my major concerns is that the state is not communicating with the county in relation to some of our approved developments, some of the rezoning that has taken place, and some of the platting that has taken place in their projections. So my question was, and my concern was, well, who have they talked to at the county to know what's in our pipeline, know what's been approved, what's coming up, that sort of thing? Is there a level of communication? If so, who have they been communicating with, and how do they get these numbers? Basically, the bottom of the line is, how do we get these numbers that I'm seeing on the reports? Because and to further expand on that is our consultants are relying on your numbers. So if they don't match with what we're showing or what we have, then those reports, we pay those consultants a lot of money. We have those studies done, and the numbers they're using are the numbers that you have.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, and I think part of this too is, what you'll hear later is that some of our communication lines are where we're building our forecast on our communications that we had 3-4 years ago. And so it's outdated information that we're building on. We don't have a formalized system for reaching out to counties, and that's something that we're looking to change moving forward as well, to have more formalized mechanisms of feedback that we're reaching out to counties so they can say, this looks good, or here's why we think this should change moving forward as well. So I just want to put out here that the forecasts are something that we update annually every year, and we just finished our cycle for last year. And so that means our numbers are just fresh new, but it also means we're starting to look on that input cycle and what things that we can change moving forward. So in a lot of ways, this is a great part for the conversation to start with.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I don't have anything. Mike articulated well what his concerns are, so we'll just see what you have to say.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're going to start with, we can go to the first slide, or the second slide, rather. Thank you. So just an overview. So first, we are going to talk about the past. And by past, the most recent past would be July of 2024, which is what our most current estimate is. But if we look at how we've done the estimates for population back to 1970 and see if that matches what you've been experiencing on the ground. But we'll look at the components of change: births, deaths, migration. But we also have to factor in age. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll pass it to Neil, and we'll talk about the future, the projections. And we'll talk a lot about that methodology, because it's what we use statewide for every county, but we'll look at those considerations for Elbert County and see what progresses from there. We okay? Okay, next slide. So estimates, I'm always looking a year behind. We just completed estimates for July of 2024, and all the estimates are based on the decennial census. So going back to the 2020 census, and we add births, new babies, we subtract deaths, we add the people moving in, subtract those moving out, to come up with the next vintage year population. So thus far, we've done that for 2020, 21, 22, 23, and 24 using this method. The birth and death data is from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and it's all the birth and death records. So those numbers are fairly solid and are at the county level. Migration data we receive from the U.S. Census Bureau, and it's based on a variety of inputs, one of which is Medicare enrollments, one of which is IRS data, where tracking federal tax returns year over year can show where people have moved. So we get state-to-state migration data that way. Next slide. So looking from 2020 to 2024, different counties in the states have been growing at different rates, and all told, the state population increased 2.9%. Elbert County, though, from 2020 to 24, increased almost 12%. And the map of all 64 counties are showing those that had growth in red, orange, and yellow, and those that had population declines in the pale blue. And Elbert, with that nearly 12% increase, is one of the fastest growing, but in terms of absolute numbers, knowing that it's a smaller county than, say, some of the metro area counties, it's a smaller absolute number. But to the point of all the work we're doing is consistent across all 64 counties and is primarily based on those births, deaths, and migration up to the year 2024. Next slide. But if we look back to 1970, we can look at how Elbert County's population has changed each year due to two things. The bright orange bars are indicating population change due to net migration. So the people moving in minus those moving out. And we do see a lot of fluctuation over the time period. We're looking at 54 years of growth on this screen. The 70s had some low years, some high years, but really for Elbert County, it was the 1990s that saw a large amount of net migration. By contrast, the blue bars, which are relatively small, especially compared to the orange, that's births minus deaths. That's how much the population changed each year due to babies. And again, compared to that net migration, it's relatively small. But it has been positive for virtually all 54 years. But the one thing we are noticing is that in the past 4 or 5 years, given that Elbert County, had that nearly 12% growth rate, you have been experiencing higher levels of growth in the past 3, 4, 5 years. And that's indicated by that net migration and natural increase. The next slide is separating out births and deaths. And in some areas of the state, this is more prominent than others. But here, The one thing that's very fascinating is that the number of births reached its peak, its highest number in the past 54 years, just last year. Statewide, peak births has occurred in the year 2007. And it does look like Elbert County had a peak around 2001, 2002, declined a bit, and not necessarily declined. These are all still positive numbers. But year over year, we have seen higher number of births in Elbert County in just the past 2 or 3 years. And just a note on births. Mothers may be having babies in hospitals throughout the metro area, and I don't believe there is a hospital in Elbert County. Births are tagged by the home address of the parents. So they may have been born at Skyridge or born at Parker Hospital, but they were attributed to Elbert County. Deaths, for the most part, are only going up, and that's totally natural and exactly what we'd expect, especially when it comes to aging. We did see an uptick in the number of deaths, especially statewide, during 2020, 21, and 22 due to the pandemic, but those numbers have come back down to the previous trajectory. Next slide. So we looked at births and deaths, but again, that net migration. We have data by every county looking at some of the characteristics of the people moving in and out, primarily by age. And what's interesting is that Elbert County tends to attract families. Here we're looking at different age groups across the bottom. So we have babies on the left, 0 to 4-year-olds, all the way through 70 to 79-year-olds on the far right. We see an increase in children. We see an increase in 30-year-olds to 50-year-olds. We see outmigration of young adults, 20 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 29-year-olds, which tends to fit probably what you see. Again, young adults leaving for more education, for job opportunities, things like that. But Elbert County tends to attract families with children. So that would help explain, given that there's been recent higher levels of net migration, that your number of births is also higher than it's been in recent years. Next slide. Something else we do is municipal projections. And for Elbert County, we have seen that unincorporated Elbert is about 85% of the total population of the whole county. So Simla, Kiowa, and Elizabeth make up much smaller shares. But in this total population, chart of total population, we can definitely see that rapid increase in the 1990s. Then more stable, slower growth in the 2000s. But again, it's ramping up again from about 2015 to 2024. So different periods of rapid growth, more stable growth, and then more rapid growth again. Next slide. So I mentioned age. We consider age to be one of the most important indicators of what's going on in a community demographically. And here we can see every single year of age. So again, babies on the left, 90 and over on the right. And each bar is indicating how many people there are in each single year of age. And actually, it looks like you have more 61-year-olds or 63-year-olds than any other single year of age. We noted earlier that we tend to see outmigration of young adults, and we see that in our age distribution, where we have lower levels of 20-year-olds. We have higher numbers of teenagers, and we have higher numbers of people in their 30s and their 50s. Now, next slide will show the comparison of the distribution of ages in Elbert County to that of the state of Colorado as a whole. So again, we have age groups across the bottom, babies on the left, 85 and over, 95 and over on the right. The red line is Colorado. It's showing the share of population by each 5-year age group. The dark blue or purple line is Elbert County. So we already know that Elbert County has fewer 20-year-olds And compared to the state, that is really evident that there's that gap there. But when we look into these older age groups, the 55, 60, 65, there's a higher share of those older age groups in Elbert County compared to the state as a whole. Again, for teenagers, looking more on the left, Elbert County has a higher share. So we look at these things to compare counties to the state as a whole. Different counties will look very different. The city and county of Denver, apparently that is where all the 20 and 30-year-olds go because they have a very high share of 20 and 30-year-olds in Denver. But there's several counties within the state that have a pattern that looks a lot like Elbert County. But knowing where your ages are, where your population is by age, will help you understand how many births you may be having, how many deaths you might be having. And then knowing the age of the people who tend to move in is also very helpful for predicting future population growth. Next slide. So that concludes the past. And just a quick, did that feel right? Did that seem to...
Made sense, yeah.
Good. That it matches your experience on the ground? Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right, and I'll go ahead and jump in here. I'm going to start with a really high level of what's the trajectory. Looking at Colorado, we start with a high state level to figure out what's happening across the state before we figure out each county having their own unique pattern, what those deviations are. Also say, right off the bat, I'm using these slides as for discussion here. If you want to stop me at any point to talk about this because something doesn't look right, because you want to say more or just want to hear more, please. We're here for the conversation, right? Next slide. Yeah, so what do we do for our population projections? Unlike the estimates, we don't do projections for municipalities. It's strictly at the county level. That being said, we do them by age and sex from 2025 to 2060. And unlike the estimates, right, which are based strongly in the data, we have to have some assumptions about what change is going to look like in the future. And those assumptions are based on those demographic components that we use for how can populations change. They can only change by births, deaths, and migration. These are the three ways that populations change, right? And I'll say right now that births and deaths have really strong theoretical drivers for how they change over time. We have a pretty good sense of how fertility rates and mortality rates change over time. For migration, it's household production dependent, it's economic dependent, it's job dependent, it's a lot of things dependent. And if you look at those things, as Nancy just showed you, over time, the natural change, births minus deaths, look pretty stable, right? That's easy to track. Migration is difficult and it's dependent on a lot of external factors. And so that's the part where we want to get feedback on, right? For the most part, we want to check against housing development, land availability, resource constraints that frankly the county and cities know better than we do. And that's the kind of components that we want to incorporate into our forecast. It's not something that we do for every county in a formalized way right now, but when you see the forecast for Elbert County, you're going to see that it is more impactful from the past discussions that we have in terms of the past conversation that I heard. And I'm so sorry, I'm relatively new, so I'm still getting the layout on each of the counties on what happened prior. But from my communications with the past projections demographer, Cindy DeGrone, she said that the projections were based strongly more so than other counties on communications that they had with past planning directors here for Elbert County. So you're going to see that reflected more in the plateau. That is not something that we would naturally ever say for a forecast moving forward. And I think that it's time for one, I was the state forecast demographer for the state of Oregon prior to this, where we had a system of built-in feedback with counties and cities where we did city forecasts there of communicating this. And that's kind of my top priority of this cycle moving forward, is to get a more formalized sense of feedback moving forward. So if we see something that we don't like here, know that this is a discussion. I'm not here to be like, this is the way that it has to be in everything. I'm trying to figure out what ways can we improve it? What information can we get in order to make these forecasts better? That being said, I will say one of the constraints that we have is that the methodology has to be a unified methodology, that we can't pick and choose. One county we do it this way, one county we do it that way, another county. It's not saying counties can't have different trajectories, but just the things that we look out for counties have to be the same. We can't do additional information for different counties out of a sense of comparison, equality for the counties and things in that
So
regard.
if all of the counties didn't participate and give you additional information, you
That's-
wouldn't be able to use information from anybody?
No, I'm saying that we have to have the opportunity.
Okay.
That the opportunity has to be there. If a county doesn't respond, we've had that, in my prior to all the time. It's just that the opportunity for the data collection has to be the same.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. No, we wouldn't want to punish any state who's like more eager to communicate with us compared to our county rather than a county that doesn't. Yeah. And why forecast at all? It's planning for the future. We all know this, and that tomorrow's Colorado will look very different than today's. And so next slide, looking at the state projections, how do we do this? Again, you already saw this before. It's the exact same way with the estimates. The only difference being is that we don't know what births, deaths, and migration are going to be. We have no data sources, so we have to make assumptions about how those things change, right? In order to get to our future populations. Population 2024 is the last year that we have data for. So even though we're in 2025, we consider that a forecast because we don't have sufficient data to call it an estimate. We have to use our forecast methodology in order to figure that out. So 2025 in our terminology is a forecast, and any year beyond 2025 also a forecast. So next slide. How do we do this? We look at mortality, birth, and migration rates. For mortality, we model this using life expectancy. We generally know that life expectancy is increasing across the United States and Colorado, and this is true for Elbert County as well. We had some setbacks with COVID where we saw life expectancy sort of decline and then plateau, but we're seeing bounce backs of this. This is an article from CPR News talking about this. Life expectancy increase between 2023 and 2024 was the largest that we had seen since the pandemic had started, and putting us on a trajectory almost similar to what we had prior to the pandemic, right? Some of our assumptions is that mortality rates increase over age. Unsurprising, you see more deaths in older age groups than younger age groups, and this increases exponentially. Life expectancy is proving. Counties are generally, historically, have had levels that they've maintained over time, and so we expect that in the forecast moving forward. This is just to say if one county has a higher life expectancy than another, we expect that to persist moving forward. That being said, all counties are improving in their life expectancy and the trajectory that we have. So people are living longer lives. What that means is that the population growth from those older ages is going to have a larger contribution. So for a county like Elbert, where the 60-plus population is very large, we're expecting a lot of aging in place to happen within the county over the next 15, 20 years. And we don't build in any expectations for shocks. COVID happened, that's a shock. That was an anomalous period. They do happen. It's not something that we incorporate in our mainline series at all of like, that was sort of like a 50, 60 year anomaly, and it's not something that we normally do for the forecast is those 50, 60 years anomalies. Next slide, please. Looking at fertility rates. Again, model them specific for each county as well. And I can say here that Elbert's fertility rate has historically been much higher than the rest of the state of Colorado. People who reside in Elbert County tend to have more children than people who reside in the rest of the counties within Colorado. So it's something that we incorporate into our forecasts. That being said, at the same time, across the state, and this is also true of Elbert County as well, declines in fertility rate. Compared to the Elbert County of 15, 20, 25 years ago, less babies, even though it's an outlier across the county overall. So we're forecasting continued decline and stabilization eventually. Elbert County is still forecasted to be an outlier in terms of its fertility rate, closer onto the 1.7 kids per woman, whereas the rest of the state of Colorado is closer to about forecasted 1.4. So it's a pretty large difference across the counties. And again, Elbert being an outlier there. And similar thing, we don't have any expectations for shock. In a similar way, COVID sort of delayed, had an impact on fertility rates as well, and that's not something that we're making assumptions on is going to happen in the near future as well. So what about migration? This is the most important one in a lot of regards. Next slide, sorry. How do we do this? Our baseline model is an economic forecast model where we take job and economic forecast across the state, and forecast a hypothetical labor demand. And we start with an initial set of migration forecasts that are based off of past trends. What has the net migration looked like for your specific county over time? Take the average of that trend over the long term and forecast that forward. And as you can see from the slides that Nancy had produced earlier, that for Elbert, there's a lot of fluctuation, some very high periods of migration, but also some very low periods of migration. So when we're forecasting, it's somewhere in the middle of that, and we've toned that down even more for Elbert County, again, based off some of those past communications that we had with the planning director at that time, going back to 2020, 2021, right? But generally, the assumption is more jobs equals more population. And it doesn't need to be jobs in your county. We also take into account commuting. We know that for certain counties and certain municipalities that act as bedroom communities, there's a lot of commuting that's happening. So job growth in Douglas County is going to have an impact in terms of population growth for Elbert as well. It's something that we also take into account. And so when the past migration trends don't match up with the labor forecast, which often is due to an undershoot, we have more job growth than population growth, then we adjust the job or the population accordingly to be like, these jobs need to get filled, these areas are going to seem more attractive, so therefore we're going to have people move into these areas, right? It's a very job-centric central forecast that we're doing, right? And the discussion that's on everyone's mind across the state right now is housing, right? Where does housing fit in? Because the places that are more affordable right now tend to be the places that people are moving to, right? And so it's not something that we incorporate into our baseline model, but it is something that we use for review and feedback. What does the housing production look like across the county currently? Does that match up? Does it look like it's going to meet up with the population demand and the population growth moving forward? There's sometimes when housing growth looks like it's going to outpace population growth. This has happened with communities such as, not to pick on them, but Broomfield County has a build out of their housing developments for the next 15, 20 years. And their housing development in recent times hasn't matched up with the population growth more recently. That being said, like, this is just to say that housing is being utilized in different ways than it was in the past. People are living in smaller persons per household than they were in the past. So it's not equating to the same kind of population growth that they've seen into the past as well. So we take that information from places like Broomfield as well and use it in our adjustments, but that doesn't mean that we have the same forecast as them or necessarily even always 100% agree on what the forecast should be. Yeah.
As an estimate, and I may vary by county, but what number are you using per household?
It varies by county, and I don't have that yet. So it will say that it is higher.
What was Broomfield?
Broomfield was 2 point, do you know off?
No, I don't.
Yeah,
A number that I'm seeing kicked around a lot is 2.7, 2.6 to 2.75.
That is high.
That is high?
Yeah, that is high.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we know that persons per household has, even since the 2020 census, been on the decline across the state. And again, you're going to see lots of county fluctuations, and we use county numbers for that. And I'm sorry, I don't have that number right offhand for you. It's something that we can look up. But 2.7 is high,
Well,
and so, yeah.
It may be high if you have a housing unit as a condo, townhome, paired home. That might be high.
Yep.
But
yep.
a single family.
But a single family home is a different situation.
It might be 2.7.
And if you look at, and totally, and again, why I mentioned why the counties are different, and when you look at those migration patterns, who's moving here, it's 30 to, young 40s with
families.
kids. So it is going to be towards the higher end for that, and something that we
That's
need
what I'm
to-
hearing from some of our applicants and some of the studies that we're seeing, anywhere from 2.6 to 2.75.
So when
I was just curious
you
what
say
you guys-
2.6 and 7.5, actually, I say that's high for the state, but totally reasonable for a county that has your demographics and shift to fall within as well. So I should take a step back in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
No. That's totally fair. And again, we'll come back to that plot on just the demographics and where housing is built up, because I think that matches up well with what you're saying. So next slide. So again, economy is really important, and what we're seeing in the economy is that there's likely going to be short-term stalls in job growth, that job growth is going to not fall off. We're not going to see massive layoffs in the near future. We're not forecasting a recession or anything like that, but we are seeing continued stalls in job growth, and that what we've seen across the state has translated into low domestic migration. We are at a pretty low point right now in terms of drawing people from other states into the state of Colorado, and it's a pattern that we're expecting moving forward as well. I will say right now that Douglas and Elbert are outliers in this regard, and you'll see a graph on that right now in a little bit. And we expect this to rebound across the state as labor demands increase over time as well. And something new that we've done this time is incorporate how international migration is going to impact Colorado, especially in the coming years. And the reason that we did this is because Colorado's population over the past 2-3 years has been tremendously impacted by international migration. Some of the policies between 2022 and 2024 of other states and the federal government have led to a sort of unprecedented increase in the international migration population across the state of Colorado. That is less so in terms of the residents of Elbert County, but I do feel inclined to mention this is something that we have taken into account for Colorado, and it's not something that we expect to increase or to persist moving forward. Every indication that we've seen is that international migration is reversing pretty strongly. And so you'll see declines for the state of Colorado in the short term in terms of migration coming in. But for counties that have strong domestic migration, we're expecting their growth to continue. And again, that's Douglas, that's Elbert, that's a few other counties like Weld, to some extent Broomfield as well.
So when you're talking about that, you're just talking about total numbers regardless of status.
Yes, so certain counties will be more impacted depending on the composition of that. And I think on the next slide, do we have this broken out? Just another one. So next slide, sorry. This is just talking about the change in the in policy. Every year the U.S. government does a forecast on what international migration is going to look like over the next 15, 20 years. It's part of their planning trajectory. It's also part of budget and financing. There was a mid-year update, which doesn't always happen, but they felt it necessary given policy and economic changes that were happening since the beginning of 2025. We used those forecasts to inform our forecast of what international migration would look like for the state of Colorado and adjusted so that it matched at the national level what Colorado traditionally sees as well. So next slide.
If I could ask also.
Yeah.
The short-term stall and job growth and the up and down. What do you consider a short-term period?
It's going to be 2 years of basically the kind of job growth that we've seen over the last 2 years is going to persist for another 2 years.
Okay.
Yep. And after that, a rebounding period where the economy picks up. And these economic job forecasts, I should say, are largely based off of Moody's national and state forecast for job growth. They're the baseline that we use. And then we account for what are the specific factors for counties and state level factors for Colorado that might alter that. So it's the relationship between this is the national level, this is how the national level changed, this is how Colorado and its regions and counties differ from the national level and what explain that, and then how does that play into the forecast for the job forecast, then go back to the population to see how does that match with each other.
Very good.
So population growth for Colorado moving forward, we're expecting Colorado to grow. We're expecting continued growth within the state of Colorado. That being said, it is going to be slower than what we've seen in the past. This is due to lower migration than what we saw in the 2010 periods, but it also has to do with lower fertility rates and less population growth amongst that population that traditionally has kids as well. So we're currently at a population of about 5.95 million and expected to hit 6 million by 2026, and then 7 million by 2045. So that's about 19 years to increase by a population of 1 million, which is considerably longer than the 5 to 6 million that it took to jump from 5 to 6 million by 2026. Less than 15 years for that one. So slower growth there. So moving forward, what's contributing, next slide, sorry, I should say that. So what's contributing to that growth, or how does that growth compare to the rest of the United States? Historically, Colorado has grown faster than the rest of the United States. And even though we're forecasting slower growth, compared to the US forecast, it's still an outlier. Between 2010 and 2020, Colorado was the 6th fastest growing state. However, post-2020, we're closer to the 16th, 20th fastest growing state. We're much more middle of the pack in terms of population growth. That has to do with two factors: one, slowing growth in Colorado, and faster growth in the United States with that international migration pickup that happened across the US. And Colorado was certainly impacted by that. It's stabilizing our growth right now. However, again, it's not expected to persist across the US or for Colorado, and it's not historically how Colorado has grown. So at some point, we're expecting domestic migration again to pick up, and that is again going to put us ahead of the growth curve for the rest of, compared to the rest of the United States. Next slide, please. So again, this is broken down by those same components that Nancy said. You can only grow by, you can break this down by two ways: net migration and births minus deaths, or natural change. In the gray is the percent growth attributable to natural change, births minus deaths, versus net migration. And Colorado, much like Elbert, has depended on migration in order to grow, right? It's needed migration in order, or rather, the bulk of its growth has come from migration, as evidenced by the blue line being much bigger than the gray line in most of those years. In fact, and if you look at this graph, you can see that gray line disappearing, and that's because we're currently forecasting that by 2047, there will be more deaths than births within the state of Colorado. And at that point, population decline will happen just simply by this aging factor, by more deaths than births happening. The only way that Colorado is going to continue to grow is if there is people moving in to make up for that, and then growth needs to come by the overcoming that even more, right? And as you saw before, for Elbert, there's even less contribution from that natural change. So that migration needs to make up a bigger factor for Elbert, because we're expecting that transition of births and deaths to happen sooner than for the state of Colorado, and again, related to aging and the average age of residents within the county here. Next slide. And this is, again, just to show the anomalous period that we had in state migration, whether it be domestic or international, that contributed to growth. Since 1990, it's been mostly all domestic migration. Domestic migration has contributed to 80% of net migration within the state, and international is only 20%, and that completely flipped post-2021. So Colorado is growing right now, but it's driven by this tenuous state of international migration, again, that we don't expect to persist. Next slide. So let's get into Elbert County, and, I want to say that, when you see this next slide coming up, it is going to look a bit strange in terms of the forecast. And this is because, next slide, please, we have this additional limiting factor on what we were told the original build out was for housing units within the county, leading to this plateau. And I think if you see this is probably the frustrating part in terms of like what's going on here. Yeah.
That's why you were brought in.
Yeah.
That was the purpose of this whole discussion today, was this graph. And I'm like, what is going on? This doesn't make sense. These projections can't be correct.
Yeah, and
somebody's not communicating with the county, and there's a breakdown somewhere along the process. Because if you look at that 34,000 by 2039, we have one development.
Yep.
Just the one development will put us at 34,000.
Yeah.
And we have multiple developments throughout the county that'll put us well beyond that by 2039.
Yeah.
So that was where the breakdown was, and I thought they can't be talking to our planning staff.
No.
And we need to get them in here. Let's find out how this works. And I have a bunch of, once we get through with this, I have a bunch of scenarios and some math that I've done. And what I'm going to do, I'm not an expert, obviously.
No.
I'm going to have you tell me where the methodology fails.
No, but here's the thing that I want to say is that in our eyes, you are the expert. You're on the ground expert, and you have information that we don't have. And this is where the breakdown in communication came from, that in the past, that we have had informal communication, just sort of updates when they occur, when people see projections that don't look like they're right, and this is what we want to change. Go ahead.
I'm not saying it's been off historically, but a lot of these have been approved in the last 2 to 3 years.
No, and exactly.
So you guys wouldn't have been aware of them, and if some of your data is from 2023,
exactly,
some of this stuff is new on the books, but we're projecting out to 2050, let's say, long-term projections. Well, those need to be included in some of those projections, and if it's dated, they wouldn't have been included.
No, totally. And Nancy, when we were here last, because this is the last time that we had that conversation where we showed this graph, and at that point, that was like, yes, this was what was going on, but that was in what, 22?
It was April of 2022. Elizabeth Garner, the state demographer,
That
had
makes
come
sense.
out and done, and I tagged along. So
Yeah, and we have had communication in the past, but again, it hasn't been formalized in the way, and this is what we're working to change right now is so this doesn't happen like moving forward. So when we have this, when you get new information about what's being permitted, what's in the pipeline, that we're made aware of this. And so that's what I'm trying to start right now so that we don't have this 2-3 year lag of
Let's say,
incorporating that
for
information.
Yeah, let's say, for example, and I know Dallas will bring this up, so let's say, for example, a development is rezoned for 2,500 residential units. Not all of those might be built out. That development could languish depending on the economy. And let's say we have multiple developments throughout the county of substantial size. Do you guys make assumptions that X% will typically be built out? Because we can't assume they'll all be built. We can't
No.
assume they're all going to be built out. So how do you do that with those development plans moving forward?
Yeah, so do you want to talk about the estimates process first?
So in terms of estimates, we are collecting housing unit data, and we try to calculate the total number of housing units in a jurisdiction as of July of the past year. When looking at future growth, and this is sort of where my experience at Douglas County helped, because for 14 years, I was doing population estimates for Douglas County that didn't match what the state demographic.
You're the expert. She's the expert. She just told us.
I have this very interesting intersection between land use and demography. And the state demography office is looking at these larger, some cases global trends about fertility, about aging, which is a whole other thing that is going to lower household sizes. But aging, migration, fertility, that we're coming from this very big picture, and we are anticipating slowing nationally and in Colorado, but then fitting that into past trends of what's been happening on the ground. And that whole use of household size is exactly what I was doing in Douglas County 14, 20 years ago. And I was underestimating the population during certain time periods, and then overestimating the population during other time periods because I wasn't taking into consideration those broader trends of lowered fertility and aging. So it is this fascinating intermix between the two, and that's what we're trying to work on.
Yeah.
And get that data to make them match. So in terms of forecasting a planned unit development that is zoned for 1,000 units, and maybe the developer was being overly ambitious and was like, we want 1,000. Maybe they were only going to build 800. Then maybe there's a recession. Maybe I know how many old developments in Douglas County shut down in 2008, 2009, but did start back up again. So in some ways, it's that timing that you may have 800 units on the books that are zoned, but depending on the economy, depending on mortgage rates and all sorts of things,
for sure.
but the timing is different. But yes, we want to be able to balance what you know you have on the ground versus these broader trends that we're seeing.
We've had them come in and ask for more
Yeah.
housing units. No, we need another 400. Let's do phase 3 now. So we've seen that too. We've seen it
Right.
both.
No.
We've seen it both ways.
Totally. And I think that something that we made adjustments on specifically were the forecast for Douglas County in particular, where we had underestimated it for several years now and have made adjustments. And I think that needs to then look to Elbert County as well, that also has such a strong commuting patterns and connection to Douglas County as well. So I'm glad that we're here to have these conversations. I do also want to go back to the aging dynamic as well, just to talk about, and your 2.7 number that you were talking about in terms of persons per household, that's happening, especially with migration into new households, but something that we've seen with places like Jefferson County where a lot of aging in place is happening, those households are moving from 4 to 2 to eventually 1. And we thought that there might be some changes in the way that people are going to move to downsize to different homes, right? Move into a place that's like less spacious, but actually a lot of people are staying in their homes, holding on to their homes longer than what we had initially anticipated, So that number is also bringing that persons per household down, and something that we need to accommodate for and think about as well when we're thinking about it for our forecasts. How, again, that's that housing being utilized differently even than it is right now with the people currently living in it. Yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to stay in the home because they have a 2.75 interest rate.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's also, I mean, this is something that happens, it's with my in-laws. Like right now, they live in unincorporated Boulder, and it's the house they lived in for 35 years. And it's like, maybe they want to move closer to their grandchild right now, but at the same time, it's like hard. Their whole lives are centered around this place, and it's so expensive unless they're buying it right out. So it's, yeah, totally. Yep.
And then to the point of, is there some place for an older adult to downsize to? And does your community, would they have to leave Elbert County
Yeah.
to find something like that? So the whole spectrum of different types of housing for different ages and different household sizes, and
Yep.
it gets complicated.
Yep. And so something I want to point out in this graph, besides that plateau is not something that we put in there without having communication, even if I apologize, that communication is a bit outdated. What you'd see here is we'd say that Elbert is definitely in a period of strong growth, and we don't expect that to persist. And you kind of see that inflection point 3-4 years out where it sort of tapers off, but continues to grow, right? That's more along the lines of like recession to average in the long-term period over. That like this boom cycle that we're in is something that, you know, you are going to help us inform us in terms of like near-term build out, but build out assumptions only go so far. We have to look at like the higher level trends that Nancy was talking about, the burst deaths. Historically, what have we seen for like migrations, like moving forward in job growth for the area, informing that, right? But then you have this plateau, and that's what got put in that cap, which reach about 35,000 right now, which comes from external information. And just so you see how that we got there, can we go to the next slide? These are the components of growth on the next slide. And you can see in our forecast period, it's all net migration. That's the only thing. And yes, births are high, but also the average age of the population in Elbert County is 2.5 years older than Colorado as a whole. And what's interesting for Elbert County is this wasn't the case in the 90s. In the 90s, Elbert County was younger than the rest of the state of Colorado. So there's been this interesting demographic shift of people aging in place within the county, whereas there's other dynamics have been happening across the state of Colorado. It's impacting it. Higher net migration can keep the population young, but if we have this limitation and like this cap in build out, which is then going to impact net migration, then we're not going to have growth because that aging population is going to take up the space that is here. Deaths are going to continue to grow while births don't increase. And so now you have the negative component of deaths outpacing births, and then the low migration component on top of that. And that's what's in the forecast right now. Currently, we're expecting deaths to exceed births by 2036, and that migration to slow because of that plateau that we have in there. And next slide. These are the trajectory for births and deaths. You can see that births have been picking up, but at the same time, deaths have also been increasing. We expect as the fertility rate for Elbert County begins to plateau and continue or decline and then eventually plateau, and the population continues to age as that bursts to peak while deaths continue to increase with aging, and that's when that crossover happens in 2036. Again, acknowledging and incorporating our forecast that Elbert County does have a much higher TFR, total fertility rate, than the rest of Colorado. So that's even incorporating that higher fertility rate. Next slide. I mentioned that in the near term, we made these adjustments for international migration. From the data that we have, there's not a whole lot of international migration that's impacting growth. It's domestic growth. So for the near term forecast, actually, we expect the growth rate that we've seen last year to persist over the next 2 years. So in the very short term, the growth rate is very strong. And then it starts to fall off a little bit as we regress to the average, and then that plateau happens that impacts the migration that as we're seeing. So next slide. And again, this has to do with like the age distribution. This is already a slide that Nancy showed you of just like who moves here. It's families. But then the thing that I want to add on to this is where are they moving and where are we seeing this growth, and why do I keep mentioning? Next slide, Douglas County. A ton. It's like where the housing growth that we have. So this is an application through the Census Bureau that shows the number of housing unit changes by block. So this is a pulled back level by census tract, but you can zoom in even further and see this by block. All of the development is happening on the west side of Elbert County. 66% of growth is happening among census blocks. These are the smallest geographic units the census keeps track of within blocks that are adjacent to Douglas County, right? So the growth is very strong and looks more similar to the census blocks that we see in Douglas County. This is a story of two, in my head, story of two Elberts, just the west Elbert and east and the west side is growing much more akin to the southern Denver counties than the eastern Colorado counties or anything
So
like
at
that.
what point do you call it a new unit? Is that when a building permit is pulled?
This is when we were just talking about that because the census has several different definitions for their housing units. This is when I believe when a permit is pulled, but let me get back to you 100% on this because this is a new data application. I need to be 100% of the source that it's coming from because we thought it might be from the master address file, but that has a Title 13 attached to it and the data is not supposed to be it. So, but I think it's from the survey, the building permit survey.
Right. It could be building permit, so at time of initiation, we're not entirely sure of this data source.
Yeah,
But we
'cause-
do know that, in general, the growth in Elbert is on the western side of the county.
Yeah, and the thing that they do when they have their housing estimates is they have this built-in assumption of building permit this time, certificate of occupancy, they don't collect that data, but they have an assumption of when the certificate of occupancy comes in, and I think it's a year?
A year or 6 months.
A year or 6
But
months, yeah.
there's a time lag from
Yeah.
building permit to
To occupancy,
completion.
yeah, yep.
So these are not going to be absolute numbers of
Yeah.
literal things on the ground, but
Yep, yep. And so the benefit of this data is that we get signal on housing units a little bit faster than we do the other components. So this is data through 2025 even. So we can get like a little bit of a flavor of like, our estimates just came out for 2024, but like what does even post 2025 growth look like moving forward? And it seems that is continuing to persist so far, so. And again, we saw 50% growth in Elizabeth since 2020, and some of the unincorporated areas just north of Elizabeth also having that 50% growth rate. Again, 60%, 2/3 of the growth is along the census blocks bordering Douglas. So next slide. What's that mean? What does that look like in comparison to Douglas County? This is kind of an ugly graph, but it's just to highlight the point that Elbert has been growing pretty damn fast, right? Douglas as well, especially when you compare it to the state overall, which is that black line, and especially when you compare it to other states that have a similar age profile to Elbert. Pueblo is also an aging community, but it's a different kind of aging community, right? And so even though they have a similar age profile, Elbert has been growing much, much faster than Pueblo. And yes, in the early 2000s, there were some periods where Elbert fell off as well. And so we saw that growth being very slow, more comparable to Pueblo, lower than the state of Colorado overall. But post 2010, 2015, and then again accelerated even in 2020, now Elbert is growing even faster than Douglas. It is by all means an outlier. And again, that's not something that we would forecast to persist along the way, to be higher than what we had seen in the past. But at the same time, we wouldn't have that plateau either. We would expect it to probably be more similar to Douglas, which we are expecting in the short term. You can see it above the state of Colorado in the forecast in the dotted line. But then as those external factors come in that we incorporate it regarding to the limitations and build out, then you see it going below the rest of the state of Colorado. And again, that was post hoc done, and again, why we're here today to revise those assumptions.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm seeing is for the next year, maybe 2 years, most of these larger developments are going to be working on the infrastructure. They're going to be digging their wells, they're going to be putting in curb and gutter, and they're going to be doing all of the engineering work and that
Yep.
sort of thing. So I think the building permits are probably going to be fairly flat. We've only been averaging, what, 220 a year for the last couple of years. So it looks like we're flat, we're not growing much, but we got all of these developments in the planning process coming in for final plat. They've been approved as a rezone or a PUD, if you will, and then maybe a preliminary plat stage or a final plat right now. And for the next few years, they're probably not going to be pulling too many building permits, and we may continue for the next couple of years pulling 200 permits or 300 or 400. So it looks like, hey, we're just kind of coasting along. But once these guys get all that infrastructure in, all that planning done, and you're saying it dramatically shifts by 2030. I'm saying by 2030, we're going to have a dramatic increase in
Yeah.
building permits in housing units.
Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge that data. At the same time, something that, we have the conversation here before is what we've run into with other counties when making these forecasts, and this is one that we just have communicated a lot with Broomfield, so I bring it up with them, is what we've seen, like their projects are one thing, and then costs come into play. And then developers start slowing down and they start losing some of the steam and the acceleration they have, right? And so we have to level it between like, these are the plan build out and like you were saying, what actually comes to fruition.
Well,
during
all
that
of these
point. So-
developers aren't spending their own money. They're using Metro District funds, so.
And that's
I'm
helpful
not-
for us.
I'm not sure if Broomfield's doing a lot of Metro Districts up there or who's financing those developments, but here it's Metro Districts, so that may or may not affect if they get built out or not.
Well, it affects that it does the infrastructure, but as far as the actual building, that would be dependent on market forces. Metro districts are the most common form of government in the state, so I assume they're being used in Broomfield. But there still is outside investment. It's not just the Metro district that is driving this, and so. There is a strong economic impact, I believe. In
I agree.
what that works.
I agree. Interest rates will play a big factor.
Totally.
Yeah, I agree.
And so, yeah. Sorry, were you going to say something? So, I mean, we're here to update our assumptions and like we're here to get a hold of the housing plan out data because it's something that we want to see. And I expect that there's going to be several iterations of back and forth between this. We're not going to just take your data and be like, this is the new answer now. I want to have continued conversation of just like what seems reasonable on high end and low end.
So I would just like to get them brought up and renewed and refreshed and another set of eyes looking at it recently, because like I said earlier, we have consultants that are using
these
numbers as population projections well into the future, and I'm just shaking my head going, no, we got to have this meeting.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you guys came out today.
Yeah. And again,
And in terms of a comprehensive plan, you can put different scenarios in. You can state that as of vintage 2023 or 24, the State Demography Office forecasted this, but given what we know about current development plans, resource use, infrastructure, our own estimate may be closer to,
I'm telling them that, but I'm only one voice.
yep.
right, typically a comp plan wants one number.
There's a water study that was done recently, last year in 2024. The comprehensive plan is being worked on now, so I think it's important. The timing is right, but I've been telling them that, and I think in the water study, I did talk to them, and they did put out a couple different numbers based on what the state's saying, and then based on some additional information. It could be this, and I think that's the way they need to go. Give us a couple of other options, saying, hey, this is, based on what we've internally looked at.
Yes, and I remember at Douglas always this concept of potential build-out and total number of units you could potentially build, but as to whether that occurred in 2040, 2050, 2060, a lot of that does depend on those market forces. Is there a new recession? Is there another this, and that? But that to know the capacity of the land, so to speak, or the resources, or the water permits, things like you could build X number of housing units, and then as to when that occurs, but then also how many people in each one, what is the fertility rate, how many are occupied by older adults, things like that.
But we're also assuming nothing else gets approved. Okay, we have projections based on what we have in-house in our pipeline, what's been approved. That's if nobody approves anything for the next 20 years. So there's going to be additional developments besides what's already on the books, guaranteed.
This is why we use this as one of the data comparison points for us. And we want to make sure, and again, we're using this economic model because we think that is, one, we have a little bit better data on trajectory for that, but also that we know the economy is going to lead into the development of these housing units. And I want to say right off the bat too, in terms of our forecast for any one given year, that number is going to be wrong. Like, we are not going to capture across the state, like a county, just like all the development that leads into specifically for 2037. But what we're capturing here is long-term trends and averages, right? Generally, this is what population growth looks like. And certainly we want to be quick to respond to a shift in the trajectory. It seems that Elbert County has a shift in its trajectory that's led up due to faster housing development. Is that something that's going to persist? That's why we're here right now. What seems reasonable moving forward? And why we're not just saying like, this number of households is what you have planned on the books, and we're going to use that for the trajectory, for the projection.
Okay.
It's a helpful data point, though. We want to look at it. We don't want to be ignorant of it.
And to contrast to, say, a mountain county, that the amount of developable land is significantly reduced due to high slopes or valleys or things, and just looking at the land area of a county is not indicative of what's buildable. So in some places, we might restrict, not necessarily restrict growth, but get input into, well, what is feasible? How much of a county's land is national forest or is just completely not buildable compared to an Elbert County, and getting a sense of, well, there's very few restrictions on how much could be built. Therefore, getting that into some of the baselines.
Hey, can I ask you guys a question? Both of these reports came from your office, so I'm going to kind of compare them a little bit. So this was one September 2025.
Okay.
And it talks about an Eastern Plains region. And I believe it's 16 counties in the Eastern Plains region. You're projecting from 2020 to 2050, this broad region is expected to see only a minimal increase of 6,700 residents in total. Okay? Then for Elbert County, same office, you're projecting, what was it, 10,040 for the same period, from 2040 or from 2020 to 2050. So are you saying all of those other counties combined are going to have a net decrease in, there's no development between the births and the deaths and different things? Is that what I'm reading here?
Can I ask? No.
have
But there's two different things that could be going on.
Yeah,
and one of
there's
them has to do
potential
with
things,
the
of
dates.
like when you pulled that second data source, because what we did recently is made a big adjustment to acknowledge that we had underestimated Douglas County. And so Douglas County, very large, just saw an upshift in October in the number revision. So if you pulled that September report, if that report is from later in October, the data table that you're looking at that talked about.
It is late in October. It says vintage 2023, prepared October 2024.
Oh,
Okay, so it still is last year.
2023.
I don't have the new one.
But to the point of the
Yeah.
Eastern Plains region is 16 some counties. And if we went back to the original map I had showed, many of those counties are seeing
declining,
declines. So
yeah.
it is very possible that Elbert, because I know Elbert is one of the largest counties in that whole 16 county region and is definitely growing fastest, that it could be compensating for declines in
Yeah.
Okay, so this,
Kiowa County,
I just
Baca
saw that
County.
and I was like, really,
So,
out of
yes.
16 counties?
You-
So I wanted to
Elbert
ask you
is-
about that while I had you.
is
Yeah.
the growth source
Can
for
you-
much of the Eastern Plains counties.
On the slides, can you go back some ways? There's going to be a map of red and blues on there. That would be helpful, I think, for this
Right.
conversation. Oh, yeah.
It's probably like,
Number 4.
yeah.
And everything in blue there is declining.
And so Elbert County,
Okay, you're right.
Bent, and Yuma, and Morgan are the only ones in that region that have growth. So yes, that would be,
Okay,
its
good to know.
declines
Yep.
in
That explain-
Lincoln,
That
Crowley.
explains these two reports. So
Yeah, yep.
Easy answer for that. Good
There you
job.
go. Okay, yeah. So we literally just updated our numbers late October. So sometimes there's a lag on when people are like looking at them, and I just want to make sure.
So one more comment, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead. That's where
So one of the things, and this is where I said I want you guys to tell me where the methodology breaks down. I took a U.S. Census Bureau report, and roughly in Colorado, not Elbert County, but Colorado as a whole, 70% of the population is over 18, that's over 18, is registered to vote, okay, across Colorado. So what I did, and then 20% was below 18 as a whole, and this is with the U.S. Census data. So I extrapolated that same information to Elbert County if we fell in line with the rest of Colorado. Big margin of error, I'm using a 10% margin of error, they only use a 5, so I doubled the margin of error just in case. So if you take the 24,759 registered voters, multiply that by 30%, you get 32,186 total adults.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you add the 20% below 18, you get 38,624 currently on the ground, if that methodology held the same as Colorado, right? You use a margin error of 10%, you're down to 34,762 people in Elbert County. If you could do that same math in Elbert County that they're using for Colorado.
The problem is, and if I understand in your age groups right, you have under 18 and over 18, correct?
Right, because we're using registered voters.
Right.
I got that from Rhonda, she's here helping
Yeah.
record. I got that from her list of voter turnout and active voters.
Yep.
So I just compared it to what Colorado was doing, extrapolated the numbers, and I didn't know if that methodology held or.
Elbert County is exceptional.
Yeah.
And how could you compare it to, especially, so you're looking at percentage of registered voters, and you're taking
Trying to
the
extrapolate.
Colorado average of how many people are registered voters, then applying that to Elbert.
And what they do is they give you the population of Colorado.
Right.
Yep.
And then they give you
Yep.
the population of registered voters. They give you the population below 18. And then I just punched in Elbert County's numbers and said, well, and they only used a 5% margin of error.
Yeah.
I doubled that to a 10% margin of error and came up with currently at 34,762 people.
Right. I would imagine that there's a higher share of registered voters to population, and especially seeing
That's why I
that,
doubled it, just in case that.
Well,
I
yeah,
doubled
but
it.
the thing is that, like, if you look at registration compared to 18 to 25-year-olds, compared to the median age of Elbert County, which is much older, it's much, much higher, right? Like, and we're using a
So
uniform
that
one.
could
Yeah.
potentially be where it
Right.
would break down.
It would break
and
down.
international migration as well, that if there are fewer people who are immigrants from other countries who may not yet be citizens or registered to vote.
They break it down.
They do, okay.
They do
so-
break it down
okay.
by, what do they say? Total population, total citizen population.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the aging factor, and if you go, yeah, a few more slides, it was the comparison between Colorado and Elbert County in terms of its age distribution, which is on slide 10. There it is, right? If you're using that for Colorado, and thinking about who is the peak of the population, that like 20 to 30, just their voter registration is just much, much lower than the 55 to 65-year-olds. And just,
So are they automatically registering them now? Dallas brought up that they're automatically registered people when they get their driver's license or renew their driver's license. They're automatically registering people currently for the last 4 or 5 years.
That's correct. But I'd have to look and see what you did, but I think you have to be real careful about looking at voters. There's so many
Yeah.
different qualifications there of what could
Yeah.
be an active, inactive. They vote last year,
Yeah.
they vote this year. There's a lot of variables there that would
Yeah.
take some real digging into to see where it was.
there's also the caveat with, and this is something that we're looking into because we're very interested in, but the DMV has been very apparent to us that yes, they're supposed to get registered within 30 days of moving. How many people do that? It's not, I was going to ask, but
Who does that? I wouldn't even
no one
think to
does
do that.
it.
Until the
And
next election was coming up, I said, oh, man, I wonder if I'm still registered.
and for some younger populations, it's not even then, right? It's not even at like the next, election. Some people don't consider themselves, even after they graduate, they think of themselves as like, well, I'm not a resident of Colorado, even if I move for college here. And then they kind of keep that up and they have external license plates.
Well, I
or
think that's
states-
the 30%
Yeah.
that we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just disproportionately higher is all I'm saying for like those younger age groups, which Elbert has less of.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so I think that's where the shift is. Yeah, I think that's a good gut check, like, because that's another data source to corroborate. But when you say what those margins are and the difference is, it doesn't surprise me too much given the age distribution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So as far as the next steps for Elbert County, what would you recommend we do as far as communicating with planning staff or to get this kind of
Yeah.
give you guys more information?
Yeah. So who's your contact for Elbert or for the municipalities?
For unincorporated Elbert, it's now going to be Ms.
nice.
Jones. I have to look, so every year for the estimates, I reach out to all the local governments to ask for housing unit data to find out how many units have been completed or permitted in the past year. And I'm beginning that process for this year, and we'll check to see who my contacts are for unincorporated Elbert. And due to staff changes and just different things, I have to update them frequently. But I will be reaching out and to my existing contact or to you, Ms. Jones, and to get that data. But that would be a foundation for then talking about the future and seeing what is zoned, platted, built, what is in the pipeline, so to speak, and getting a sense of what's going on there that we can then talk with the projection side and forecast side to see what to incorporate.
Yeah, so Nancy in the estimate process has a beautiful setup of communication with cities and unincorporated areas to get that gold standard of certificates of occupancy for the estimates. And we don't use those for projections, right? We want to know like what's going to happen moving in the future. So right now we're using that as a starting point of that is going to be our potential contact for housing units moving forward. That being said, I can also just reach out to you directly if there's someone to get in better communication with of just to get an idea of like where and when the timeline is for these units that you're talking about to see how much of a deviation that we have from the current population to match up. That would be, yeah.
Yeah, we currently have, I would say rough after yesterday, we currently have from the beginning stage of a rezone up to final plat, and currently in the building process, we have up to probably 9,500 building units. Pretty significant. If you multiply it by 2.7, you're getting 25,000 people.
Yeah.
And that's if nothing else gets approved.
Yeah, that would be a nearly doubling of the population size.
I think that's a shift in the trajectory.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I definitely want to incorporate that information, and I want to also be like, what's realistic in terms of models of other places that we build. Elbert has obviously seen fast growth in the past as well, but we have to take into account as well the fact that we're seeing slower job growth, slower migration across the state. Like, where are these people coming from? Who are they? You know?
Yeah. Well, I think they're tired of living in Denver, and I think they're passing over Denver. If they're coming from out of state, they come out here because it's maybe a little less expensive. They have a little more room. I don't know. So
Yeah.
I don't think if you look at Denver and say, oh, it's slowing down, that you can still look at Elbert County.
No, and no, we would never say that one thing that's happening in Denver is also happening to Elbert. Totally. Yeah. That being said, in terms of Colorado's just taking a step back, attractiveness as a state overall, we have seen declines in that in recent years, right? And that's going to impact the whole of Colorado, and some places more than others, but it's something that we need to take into account as well.
So the recommendation for these consultants would be, hey, you need to talk with our planning department to get better numbers, because we have a meeting with them this afternoon as far as the steering committee, the planning commission, planning department, and the consultant on our comprehensive plan. Any suggestions on what we should tell them, or just let them run with this 36,000 number, but I don't know what number they're using, by 2050 for our comprehensive plan? 'Cause that's totally unrealistic in my mind.
Yeah, and I understand your frustration. It's difficult with timelines right now with just sort of the meetings that we had already planned out in the holidays, but I'm trying to figure out a realistic timeline to get you some back and forth and to give you a sense of ballpark on what some updated numbers can be, because we're going to obviously revise this moving forward. I can't give you any promises on timelines, but why don't we get communication started like literally today and start an email chain going?
Okay, well, let's exchange information
Yeah,
before
of
you
course. Yeah.
There we go. Can you all help me understand just a little bit about what your, I guess, factor or ratio or something is going to be in terms of zoning or approved land use or a future land use map, right? Those all mean very different things, but how you all would factor those in. Because in my mind and my experience of what I've seen, there's always developments that aren't built,
No,
right?
100%.
Either they're not built
That's
at
my-
all, or
yeah.
they're not built out, or there has to be some sort of happy medium, right? And that's what I'm kind of trying to understand is while, a certain number of units have been zoned, what is a realistic, I guess, factor, right, that you could kind of multiply that by to actually get some type of population? I just feel like it has to be maybe somewhat more complicated than if we build it, right, then they will fill up.
No, it's definitely not that. And again, this is sorry, I'll let you
Yeah,
share.
no, but I also completely understand that there's obviously a driving force that's, right, I guess,
But
requiring those two or incentivizing those to even move forward at all, right? So something's driving that as well. And so I think that's kind of what we're looking for, right, is what can we kind of depend on? I know they're all estimates, right, but how do we help figure out what that middle ground is on terms of, they want to build everything?
can I make a suggestion?
Of course.
You tell them what's in the pipeline and let them figure that out, because they're the experts that would figure that out for us. And that's assumption that nothing else gets approved. So we can err on the side of caution, because we're not including anything that gets approved in the next 20 years. Any new development, any new subdivision that gets up and gets platted, and we're not taking that into account at all. So I say we just give them, as far as the county is concerned, we just give them what we have, what they ask for. Hey, what state is it in? Has it just been rezoned? Is it in a final plat? Is it in a preliminary plat status? And then let them figure out what projection they want to use, because
Of course.
I hear you. I think that this is, again, just like one data point, and we're not going to say that it's just like everything is going to be completely filled. What I've done historically, and again, this is with Oregon, not the state of Colorado, we're still trying to figure out the best way to do this, is look at comps, like areas that had similar trajectories, like in the plans of potential build out and what actually manifested. There's always 2-3 comparison points that like we can point to and what actually like manifested during that. There's conveniently usually a high and a low of like.
yeah, you don't want to look at 2007, 2008.
What happened
probably
then?
for the 4 years after that. You don't want to look at COVID, the 3 years of COVID. So we definitely have some periods in there that I would eliminate
At the same
unless
time,
something
we're also,
extraordinary happened.
yeah, at the same time, we're also balancing against this of our very modest job growth in the near future, and very modest like economic and job expectations. So like that is a balancing part into this equation. And we're not going to, this is going to be an ongoing discussion. I think there's going to be a few different numbers that we're going to probably talk about. So what we're not going to do is take all of this data and give you a number and be like, that's it. This is why we came up with it, and that's why. It's going to be a continued conversation, and I think there's a couple of different ways that we can approach it, and I think that we can come at the end of something that's sensible in
Makes
the
sense to everybody.
conversations. Yep. I don't think everyone's going to be 100% happy. I think that we'll get everyone at the table like 70, 60% happy, has been my experience when we do something
Well, I
like
think
this.
whatever it is, it's going to be better than what we have. I think we can all agree
I
on
think
that
that's
for
it.
Elbert County, at least.
I mean, this is great for the time. That was the appropriate thing to do, given who we're in communication with, and it's outdated. That's all, and we just need to get that new information incorporated.
I guess I'll just maybe clarify just one thing that if you all could help us understand, which is, from your experience, is housing, we'll just call it housing, I guess, housing entitlements, are you seeing that drive growth? Because I would have expected that growth drives housing entitlements. And so I feel like that's maybe what I'm wanting to understand a little bit better.
It's why we use the job model first. It's because we think that jobs drive growth. But what we're seeing is that because of the lack of housing development that happened in the post-2007s, that now housing does actually drive growth in some areas, especially when it's tied to affordability. So it's something that we're paying attention to a bit more, even though our baseline model, what I presented, is the jobs growth. Yes. So that's still going to be our baseline, but we want to again, I don't want to ignore the housing data. I think that this is important to look at, see how it matches up with our commuting and jobs data. Are they in agreement with each other? And if they're not, that's why when we come back to the conversation to be like, hey, something isn't speaking right. Yeah, you're planning out all this build out, but like from who and where are they coming from? Especially, we're not forecasting recession. If we are, it's just like that's when we want to have these conversations. Yeah.
And the timing becomes the challenge, which is, I think I heard you say that's why you would use building permits for the most current numbers versus entitlements. Is that correct?
In terms of doing the municipal and unincorporated estimates, we use building permits and/or completions to get a sense of what's on the ground, what's built as of a certain date. For going forward, again, we have not historically included entitlements, zoned, platted, whichever, but understanding whether a community does have room for growth versus places, again, like some mountain community that literally does not have land area, or perhaps a Jefferson County that in many ways is built out. So I think our very first thing is to, in a way, take off the
artificial constraint.
The artificial constraint.
Because that did come from communications about.
Right.
Yeah.
We had communicated with our former forecast demographer just yesterday, who said she had received communication sometime in the past 3 to 5 years, which is what put that stagnation, that limited growth there. And so not having the full details of what that was about, what was the reasons for that. So if our very first step is take that off,
so we can just
see what
look
it
at
looks
growth,
like if there was not this impediment.
So that could have been a realistic projection at that time.
Exactly.
Because it was stagnant at that time.
Exactly. And
So they're just projecting that.
if
Well,
it
right
was-
now, we're stagnant and we're not seeing a lot on the horizon, but we've had a huge spike in the last 2 or 3 years.
right, that yes, because I remember when we were here 3 years ago, one of the questions was, when is the recession coming? When is there going to be a recession? Because things were so uncertain in 2021 and 22. We were still dealing with the pandemic. There was so much uncertainty that you might expect, yep, this is it, growth is over, we're done. Yeah. And if that then gets incorporated into a 30, 40-year forecast, so I think we take this new information, we run the model as it is without that impediment, see where it takes it. Because much of what the modeling looks like is if the state as a whole is expecting this much migration, this much growth, sometimes it just gets distributed to the various counties. And we look at that distribution for Elbert. And if we know you have land, we know you have capacity, we know you have infrastructure, maybe some of that gets a little bit higher than, say, a place that is built out or has land constrictions and things like that. So I think we start with that first pass, see what it yields, and go from there. My other comment is about entitlements, things that are zoned, and knowing the history of some developments in Douglas County, where I can list off Maribel Village, which was zoned and platted in the 70s, and the developer ran away with the Metro District money, and there was no money for water or streets. That's still on their books. We knew that, okay, those 500 units were never going to be built at that density. Other instances within the town of Castle Rock where things were zoned, platted, and only now, 40 years later, because this was in the 1980s, is the money got put together, the growth is there, and they're starting up. So knowing what's on the books always has to be looked at within the context of where's the money coming from? And to the point of, since the 70s and 80s, rules, laws, codes have updated to prevent those things from happening. That was a very extreme case of the examples from the 70s and 80s. But even something like Lone Tree, we knew that Lone Tree had 30,000 units zoned on the books. But we don't know that all of them are ever going to be built. And it could be out to the year 2100. So again, the benefit of my experience with land use in Douglas is to see the various stages of something being zoned, being platted, and to the point of once something's platted, there is a better chance that building permits will be pulled because it can be. But the economy, how many construction workers we have in the state could be a limiting factor. If there's nobody to build all these units because of a variety of labor force issues, that too could slow you down. And it's not something that you would ever notice, ever pick up on in some of these larger metrics, except when we look at jobs. So this very interesting balance. And so, yes, getting the numbers that you have, but to the point of everything that's entitled or zoned typically never completely gets built, or might 40 years later. So again, it's a balance.
Do you have a factor that says we predict this much growth in the future of housing development? Because that is factored in there, because you're going to say, we're assuming you're going to make assumptions on what's been platted or what's been zoned. Okay, fair enough. But we don't take into any account or any assumptions of any future growth being approved. You just update as we go, so a couple years later, we would update and just kind of see how it went? Is that how that moving forward would go then?
I hate to keep using Douglas as an example, but knowing that 40% of the land in Douglas County is national forest, that was never going to be built on. I can't say never anymore, but that was off the books. Douglas County also reserved large tracts of land as permanent open space. We knew that was never going to be built on. We know lots of areas where there was no water supply. Any new development was going to be dependent on a well. Then we could look at what the aquifer looked like. Is there enough water to support? And so maybe, yes, we knew whole areas could only be 35-acre developments, like one house on 35 acres. So we had a sense of all of southeastern Douglas County, one house per 35 at most. But then we get into the town of Castle Rock. They do have a water system. We knew what they had zoned and platted over the years. And so we could take some of that with a grain of salt. Okay, yes, this might come up, this might happen. Sterling Ranch, knowing what their water supplies are, how just...
Interesting, okay, wow.
But we had a...
You guys have a system, for sure.
We had because to the point of, if you have all of eastern Elbert County, do they have water? Is the zoning currently agricultural? So it is one housing unit per 35 acres. To rezone that, you would have to have proof of infrastructure, water, things like that. Oh, yeah. And given the distance it is from other places, it may never support more than one house per 35 acres, or one house per 20.
It's a big county, and a lot of it will remain rural for our lifetime, and well beyond.
Right. So I think you could probably pare down and get a better sense of what could potentially be the maximum, given water being one of the foundational restraints.
And like I mentioned, updates. We stay in communication.
Yeah.
What's going on next year? What happens next year?
Exactly.
And we just communicate on an annual basis, or...
Exactly.
Exactly.
Something that I want to, fix is that, as Nancy had just mentioned, we do have this artificial cap that's built in. We have a model that is not that could maybe be our starting point, is just looking at past trajectory of growth, because Elbert, in a lot of ways, is better than some other counties that are just starting growth. We have a history and trajectory of growth and plateaus. But right now, the plateau that we have is artificial. We have our baseline model in there, so we can start looking at the baseline model even before looking at the housing units just to be like, what have we seen in our historic trajectory of growth? Because that's always the part that we start out with. And then use other data to inform and adjust that trajectory moving forward. So we can see maybe it matches up and maybe this conversation is moot. Something, I mean, definitely not, because we're expecting, you're saying doubling in the next 10, 15 years, which again, that's a data point I want to incorporate. It doesn't mean that we're going to forecast that at all. It's just, we're going to see what's feasible given past trajectories, given other counties' development. But this number is not it that we have right now, so.
And just to clarify one last thing, so based on the census tract data, you're able to handle maybe that far western portion of the county in a different way than maybe the other 80% of the county. Is that fair? Because I think sometimes when we say county, right, that incorporates what, like 1,850 square miles, and so much of that area is very, very different, right, than, again, maybe the 10 miles that's directly adjacent to Douglas County and potentially even Arapahoe County.
Yeah, we are not expecting that to grow. That is not something that we are incorporating into our assumptions. Is there like a specific parameter that's like this census tract is going to not be built and this one will continue to build out? No, but it's how we review, like, what is the feasibility of this?
Okay.
And also, like, why we're going to come back to you with the numbers and why this is going to be a back and forth. And if something along those lines is that we can accommodate that growth within these census tracts where all the building is going to happen, that's something that you're going to tell us and we can come back to as well. Yeah. I just want to stress enough that, like, and on both sides, when this is too low for you to come back to us as well, for us to have this back and forth as well. I don't want to make us seem that like we're the point on high on like, we're going to tell you what the forecast number is. We're the point that aggregates all the data and takes the high level signals, and you guys are giving us on the ground level information, and it's an exchange, and we're going to end up at a product that's better when we're all informing it. I hope that's the goal. Definitely, yeah. And why we want to formalize these partnerships more moving forward.
I got to say, I was impressed meeting you guys and the wealth of knowledge that you guys brought to the table, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us, yeah.
Very happy to do it.
Yeah,
Good information.
yeah.